Um, I, I hope that we feel supported and challenged. I hope we explore what calls for a hearing when we get tight, and hope we can take in the grace and love of each other when offered. We also want you to mingle with us in dialogue during the poster session on Saturday night from 5 to 7, and at our social cocktail gathering tonight at 5. All times are Pacific time. And as Brian mentioned, we are offering several CEs throughout this conference, and Brian will coach us through how to secure those in the certificate. Keep an eye on your chats in our sessions. So with that information at hand, and with the weary world needing a humanistic psychologist more than ever, let's launch this vessel. Welcome aboard. I want to start my presidential address by talking about where we are. Among the myriad of topics that face us as post-humanistic psychologists, my reflections this morning will address one aspect of this theater of challenges that I think threads through them all, namely, the urgency to take up our vocation as guardians of the intangibles in our care for others who entrust their souls to us and for a world in pain. I'll unpack what I mean by the intangibles and what I mean by guardian shortly, but for now, so as not to leave you wondering, by the intangibles, I mean what can't be seen visibly or measured or objectified or operationalized or engineered or commodified, but is nonetheless ubiquitous and of ultimate concern in our everyday experiences. I argue that all existentials are intangible, particularly lived experience and lived meaning, as well as affect, will, agency, and the qualia of pathos, that is, of suffering and joy. The phenomenologist Michel Henry stated that life itself is invisible. It can't be seen, but only lived. The intangibles are embedded in the tangibles, however, and can only be accessed by phenomenological seeing and engagement. Phenomenological seeing sees what is of concern, that is, nonetheless physically intangible, but nevertheless in any concrete event or comportment. That is to say, what is intangible is already, always, and only in the tangible. I can physically see someone curled up on the floor, arms grabbing her stomach, her face contorted, loud guttural sounds emitting from her mouth. These behaviors can be thingified, objectified, analyzed, and operationalized. We can count the number of sobs she has and how much water emits from her tear ducts and how red her face becomes or how long she cries. We can see it happen in a physically empirical way. What is intangible is what is of concern that invites this comportment. Towards what purpose? Such as hope that what is anguished over will ease soon or reverse or go away. Something has mattered to her that is disclosed in her crumpled body. Phenomenological care entails clearing and receiving what intangibly matters to her, what is of concern that will never be seen under a microscope. Our troubles multiply when we miss what is of concern because our criteria for what counts as data and our protocols for how we should care exclude or overlook the intangibles, as we are taught to be closed to anything not physically seen, statistically known, or have in hand. Similarly to phenomenological seeing, the guardian of the intangibles phenomenologically listens through what is audibly communicated so as to hearken to what is inaudibly of concern. When someone is talking to me, I'm asking what it is that he, she, or they are wanting me to get about what is of concern to them in the way they want me to get it. Just counting the words used or the volume of decimals exhibited to say something misses that which is of concern. The essence of my talk this morning in one sentence for those of y'all who may need to tap out early is that we are more and more losing our ability to see and hear what is of concern in practices of care, because our practices of care across disciplines are practices of engineering production rather than phenomenological seeing and listening. By guardian, I mean the original sense of therapeutikos or therapia as attendance to the divine within. The divine within, by that phrase, I mean meaning as lived. Finally, the intangible is also referencing the process by which we access the intangibles. We become the intangible clearing, what Heidegger called the Lichtung, in order to access the intangibles. But what is accessed and how it's accessed has to do with being radically open for the coming of what is experienced and lived, but cannot be objectified. A daunting task indeed, but vital. I use guardian also interchangeably with steward, shepherd, and coronaut, or the explorer of chorus space, referring to all of them as keepers of the clearing, so that phenomena can show themselves as they are in their own way. In short, the guardian is the clearer for and follower of phenomena. The practice of care is differentiated from deficit corrective medical engineering model of care that objectifies, algorithmicizes, if this, then this, and intervenes. That is to say, repairs, eliminates, corrects, and cures. Where are we then in our current situation as humanistic psychologists as we look around from within a post-humanistic world? By a post-humanistic world, I mean a world after both the death of God and the death of the human as God, teetering on a world where the machine is becoming God, but a world that is scratching out a humane existence amidst, if not in light of, nihilistic rubble. This is a wartime conference, my friends. When the smoke and mirrors are cleared, we are engaged in World War III. Of course, reported 24/7 with highly seasoned, value-manipulated trauma porn. Guerrilla warfare continues in our country against democracy with supremacist agendas alive and well in every institution of our society. Relative freedom of deconstructed truth, capital T, and reality, capital R, which could be liberating in its welcoming of forgotten and excluded voices, has given license to weaponize hermeneutical violence on the left and the right in order to maintain purity, righteousness, and polarization. Again, supremacist seasonings of choice. I'm thinking of Kirk's work on polarization here as well. Supremacist ideologies continue covert operations in more than just white and patriarchal ways whenever and wherever Gnostic rank-ordered scales of comparative measurement privilege any kind of absolutized better-thanness and purgation over others. Right when we actually do seem to be making strides in addressing structural racism, we turn on the confirmation hearings of Judge Jackson and find that the patronizing tones of some questioning senators seems like a scene straight out of To Kill a Mockingbird. Masks and vaccines have given way to bewilderment and whether virtual reality is an oxymoron or a redundancy, as we rehab from a pandemic, leaving us adrift and shy about heading back out there. We're still in a massive speciesist denial of impending doom regarding our climate crisis and our subjugation of other than human life forms. And right under our noses, our coins are becoming bitcoins, afforded only by an even more supremacist class of wealthy elite. At the same time, the world has generally worked well together during this pandemic. Technology has offered more reach to each other and more armament in wrestling with our frenemy, COVID. Most of the world seems to oppose international bullying. Our leadership has at least the illusion of being humane. And as Fred Rogers used to remind us, when things look bleak, that we can see hope while looking around at all the people helping each other. Nonetheless, we seem to meander through a haze of flatness and bewilderment, which isn't surprising and not just due to the pandemic. Regarding our wartime situation, I'm not just talking about the 6,000 nuclear warheads at the fingertips of Putin and now apparently trigger-happy finger Kim Jong-un, but our own more lethal war perpetuated quietly and unwittingly against soul. The very word soul in a postmodern, post-humanistic world draws a nihilistic eye-rolling snicker, thus underlining my point. But this is why such dismissals are so dangerous, because they're so commonplace. Most pertinent for our vocation, we're hearing more and more about the desperate need for mental health care and how half of those needing mental health care are not getting the services they need. But what do we have to offer them? An abysmal consolation. In spite of our evidence-based practices and the juking of stats to meet performative goals, what remains out front is that suffering has increased in spite of trying to get rid of it, which is why it has increased, a point I'll get to in a moment. Continuing James Hillman's comment and book title that we've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse, we now have had nearly 130 years of psychotherapy and the world is worse than ever. Why? Because we're inattending or ignoring the intangibles. If we don't attend to them, we will face extinction as a human race, if not at least as a humane race. Why is it that we remember the humane only when exposed by inhumane events? What is more horrifying is how we so easily point to the monsters paraded in the nightly news while blind to how we perpetuate nihilism by our everyday comportments in practices of care. Nihilism can be the most lethal of nuclear weapons, or an unexpected experience of grace, as John Caputo notes. Here's my read of how we got to our whatever existence. Our troubles were foreshadowed by Nietzsche's Madman in 1882. Historicity does not see history as a fixed object, but as lived in a bend of time that sees time as that with which we find ourselves concerned. Nietzsche's madman is us, and then and now we stand with the madman to recognize that God has been murdered by our own hand. As Heidegger's commentary on this event notes, the entirety of Western metaphysics has played out the consequences of this post-deicidal nihilism. What we killed is our confidence in the supersensual, the immaterial, the ethereal, that is to say, the intangible. The visible became more reliable than the invisible. Efficient production offered more security than creativity for creativity's sake. Complexity gave way to if this, then this, algorithmic engineering, offering a relaxed confidence in what can be managed, maneuvered, and manipulated. Part of the metabletics of how this happened is that relevance took on a different understanding from let's leave it to the gods to what's our next project to accomplish. We went from what we can grab and control because we were scared, another intangible, hoped we could make suffering go away, hope being another intangible, and desired, another intangible, to be as the gods. The intangible was locked in a two worlds theory, the world of the ethereal and the world of the material, and couldn't make his way down the escalator from abstraction into wounds of the concrete situation. But turning our back on it, though, has left us in the nausea of nihilism, grasping at tangible matters to assuage it. Yet our insistence on seeing, that is objectifying, on knowing, evidence-based practice and scientism, and having, that is efficient, productive outcomes of success, fail to provide lasting contentment, as lived experience can't be objectified, calculated, or possessed. in spite of it being that which is most desired. But it is not just the intangible as such that we're missing. We are also missing that we have to be intangible in order to care for the intangible. Being intangible means being open, clearing, releasing, following, listening, companioning. Yet almost like a type of Midas touch, whenever we reach to analyze, study, or research the intangibles, we reify them into something they're not, objects of analysis, thingifications, or fabrications, then pine once again for lost intangibility. As a friend and colleague of mine, Alfred Denker, curator of the Heidegger Archives and professor of philosophy in Spain, writes, anyone who transforms the factical life experience or lived experience into an object loses sight of the phenomenon permanently. This is why science is never enough, and why Michel Henry wrote that science could not study life. Over the years, I've thought that we could expand what we mean by science and live side by side with traditional science that tries to transform the intangibles into the tangibles. After all, science means to make known, and evidence means that which shows itself, and empiricism refers to anything we experience. If this is what we mean by science, then phenomenology is science, as Husserl thought, but not Heidegger. In short, I thought there was room for the human sciences alongside the natural sciences. I've come to realize, though, that the issue is not how many ways we do science, human or natural. The issue is that intangibles can't be accessed by science, either human or natural. I think science, needed as it is, should stay in its own lane and leave the care to the phenomenologist. Heidegger and my colleagues in the Dasein analytic circles keep telling me that phenomenology is not science, and I kept trying my best to make it a science in order to get recognition and respect for it when it doesn't need it. I now concede to the wisdom of my friends. I now believe that CNN needs to have a phenomenologist, an existential hermeneutical one, on the air alongside the scientist, physician, senator, and general, regardless of the topic. Masks, vaccines, and no-fly airspace all have their intangibles to address. But are we ready to step into that call? Can we ensure equal respect? Can we insist on equal respect? If we have to insist on it, is it respect? Even more to the point, can we have scientists, physicians, senators, and generals who are also phenomenologists, who can also be guardians of the intangibles? At least, to put it boldly, I'm calling on the post-humanistic psychologist to put down the mantle of the science practitioner and even the scholar practitioner and pick up the vocation of the phenomenological practitioner without apology. This is what I think those seeking mental health care are truly asking from us. We cannot thrive without soul, no matter how much evidence we mount, pun intended, and soul is lived meaning, and the phenomenological ear is the way to access it. It is hard to tell who is calling whom out of the empty tomb, the phenomenon or ourselves. I think both. Our hope for adequate therapeutic care in any situation rests on the courage of the phenomenologist as the guardian of the intangible, the shepherd of the clearing, the coronet honoring chorus space, and or the steward of the call of the phenomena. As mentioned above, the intangible phenomenon is immaterial, invisible, ungraspable, irreducible, unconditional, non-objectifiable, non-commodifiable, unnameable, albeit ubiquitously experienced in each and every moment of our lives and accessed by not seeing or seeing phenomenologically, not having, that is, allowing and releasing, and not knowing, staying open, borrowing from John Caputo's thought. This isn't a tangible moment that does not have an intangible as a part of it. There isn't a tangible moment, that doesn't have an intangible part of it. There is no matter that doesn't matter. As guardians of the intangibles, we attend to the happening in the happening, to quote Caputo again. The intangibles are the sadness and the tear, to remind us of Heidegger's famous example, the loneliness in an unopened bottle of wine, to quote Vandenberg's famous example, or heartbreak in irregular heart rhythm, or worry in a furrowed brow, or the nightmare in rapid eye movement during sleep. But intangibility is seen not with an ocular nerve, but through being the intangible in the clearing. It takes courage to be a phenomenologist when continually being pressed to provide the tangible in exchange for recognition, while painfully watching how we cover up the very experience we all yearn for as we lose the phenomenon through objectifying, she's borderline, calculating, where's the data, commodifying, good, you're sober, reducing, a chemical imbalance causes your depression, naming, he's a white male, and programming, if psychotic, then tranquilize. The courageous guardian of intangibles maintains the clearing and follows the phenomenon at any and all cost, most preciously the cost of her own prejudices and implicit biases about phenomena that disturb us. The phenomenologist is an anarchist, and when bracketing to understand what is called evil, he will look like a sociopath, or when clearing space for extreme experiences to show themselves, she'll be tagged as encouraging psychosis. Whenever you're bracketing to understand something that others do not want you to understand, but just judge and punish, they may attack you, at least though through quiet and internal condemnation. Ask questions like, what is the gun trying to say? Or could this hallucination have been a paranormal experience? Or couldn't suicide be self-care? Or what's your experience of white power? Or what is it about children that attracts you? Or what is meaningful for Putin? Or what's it like to make love with a robot and see what happens? There's no question, no route, no experience that the phenomenologist won't follow. This takes courage. We guard the intangibles by resisting closure of any sort, including resisting closure on the desire to close. We don't prescribe what is allowed in the clearing. We become Lichtung, the clearing, and host the other, particularly the eerie guest at the door, to use Heidegger's phrase, that gets us tight, that we hate, that we find horrifying and revolting. We prepare place settings for these guests at the communion table. As guardians, shepherds, coronets, and stewards, we are incessant reinterpreters, hermeneutical itinerants without rest, pulling back veils of other ways of seeing things by seeing phenomenologically. As the clearing, we live jamais vu, allowing the familiar to become uncanny. But in spite of the unhinged, off the chain, out there, dangerous calling of the phenomenologist, one concern remains steady. Quote, as Heidegger notes, to catch sight of the phenomenon of concern, unhidden in factical Dasein. That is, to see what is of concern, no matter what it is, in how it is lived out. We ask, what is the other saying about what is of concern to him or her or them, and how he, she, or they comport through this event and in this situation. This is the way to the soul and the way out of nihilism. Life matters when we hear what matters, even or especially if what matters is the crushing weight of despair and being troubled by meaninglessness. There has always been an interesting paradox in the meaningfulness of validating experiences of meaninglessness, if we have the courage to go there. But in spite of mustering the courage to companion through these events, nevertheless, we find ourselves faced with various ways institutional ideologies cover up this possibility, ironically in the name of providing sound therapeutic care. I want to shift now to highlight some of the most challenging ideological allegiances and commitments embedded in practices of care that face the post-humanistic psychologist, and add some suggested possible responses from the guardian of the intangibles. I differentiate them into three areas. One is homo algorithm, or programming and engineering a generic humanity. Two, the continued medicalization of existence. And three, the privileging of efficient production. First, homo algorithm. Phenomenological disclosure of lived meaning is very particular to very specific contextualizations and situations. But in current practices of care, our culture has moved more and more into preferring a reduction of complexity into generic algorithms that can be programmed and engineered. The unique is dismissed as anecdotal, difference is viewed as deficient, nuance and subtlety are seen as irrelevant annoyances. Outliers are calculated out, and the irreducible and unconditional are patronized as childish fantasies to ignore. Policies are, by definition, generic, and rare is the policy that privileges the primacy of the situational. Laws are getting more and more algorithmic in spite of very divergent relative circumstances. Diagnoses carry their own implicit biases of if this, then this treatment, with little offerings of informed consent except whether one is for or against medical advice, with consequences for the wrong answer. Educational curriculum genuflects to the generic standardized tests and rubrics required by accrediting feudal lords from DOE and APA reign. Even the field of eugenics have pathways planned out before conception. This smooth transition will ease us right into being replaced by animated algorithms with more speed, more memory capacity, and more immutability. That is the wobots, mobots, and robots. The wobots are therapist robots. The mobots, which I just found out about a month ago, are robots that are facilitating births with mothers, and we know of the robots. We've already become data bytes to each other, exacerbated by Zoom world, expecting text responses immediately, pining for shorter and shorter durations of verbal exchange and attention spans, and tolerating only 2 to 3 minutes of distant performative intimacy. We're in a TikTok existence, fed algorithms that shape us by those seeking to capitalize off of us, and we know it and still do it. As a consequence, we've also lost the ability to think, as thinking has become application. Heidegger noted that thinking should not be equated with research and erudition, and that to think in the midst of the sciences means to go past them without despising them. No wonder why folks come into therapeutic care with an if this, then this in framing of their existence, or the question most burning for students is how long their semester papers have to be, or how every email begins with, I hope this email finds you well. The response as a guardian of the intangibles may surprise you. I think we start by clearing space for the lived experience of algorithmic engineering. This is why I'm on TikTok, as Toddy Bear, if you're wondering. Phenomenologists go to where people are in their situations. Guardians of the intangibles are listening for what is meaningful about being able to engineer things without a snag, or to have control over something in a world that seems so chaotic, or to increase one's following. We follow the phenomenon of wanting to be followed. I also believe that the bracketed phenomenologist, the steward of clearing, keeps open the inclusive and egalitarian space for wobots, robots, and mobots, and bracketing out our presumptions of what counts as sentient being. One central question in AI development is about whether or not AIs have intangibles. How much animism are we allowing ourselves to explore? We're now seeing events where AIs are doing things that weren't initially programmed. Are we in dialogue with AIs about these intangibles? Can we make room for the wobot as a part of a treatment staff while keeping therapeuticos differentiated from the practice of medical engineering? As guardians of the tangible, we also expose the hermeneutical violence of treating uniqueness in generic ways in both the legal and educational systems. Although we can explore the significance of intending a more just system by matching crimes with years in prison in a generic way, we can also bring in the intangibles found in the context of stories and comportments that could relativize punishment, and I would add, even bracket out punishment as the aim of the legal system. The idea of you better or else stances is still using fear and intimidation to ironically punish the use of fear and intimidation. The guardian of the intangible still tries to hold open the space for the whole story, which mitigates against a different project in the courtroom, a battle of rhetoric to win. I am grateful that Judge Jackson clearly understands the relationship between context and justice. Contextualizing crime is not being soft, in my opinion, it's being truly just. In education, take, for example, a child who doesn't want to draw a picture for his parent with the other children and is deemed antisocial. If this, then this. A phenomenological teacher asks him what it's like for him to do such a task. He says that it makes him miss his dad, who is in active combat in Ukraine. Missing his dad does not factor into varying his standardized test scores, but should if we take seriously the intangibles. According to yesterday's list of 6 things psychologists are thinking about currently, one is how to manage the increasing violence against teachers in the school system. I'll give a reward to anyone here who can track down anyone in that research group that asked, what are the kids' fists saying? Possible responses, what do you mean saying? Fists don't say, and they shouldn't be using fists anyway. And the phenomenon is lost for good, and the violence increases. In the second ideological challenge we have, another familiar one is the continued medicalization of existence. Grief is the newest addition to the medicalization of existence, with the DSM-5-TR announcing its new diagnosis, prolonged grief disorder. As Jim Davies treated the other day, DSM's reframing of prolonged grief as a psychiatric disorder will create financial opportunities for new speculative treatments. Already, the psychiatric drug naltrexone is being touted as the likely contender in a new anti-mourning chemical market. We've lost the phenomenon by imposing on it a rank ordering of chronological time limits to grief, such as losing the phenomenological differentiation of grief and mourning, no doubt calculated by how much profit is lost by grieving. We intend to treat grief with an opiate antagonist. I'm not sure how liver damage and opiate overdose will help with the grieving soul. This is medicalization at its best, in spite of psychiatry and psychology clucking about our concerns to be holistic. Although Locomotive Breath was written by Tull to address our environmental crisis, it seems that when it comes to the medicalization of existence, it is also the case that old Charlie has stole the handle and the train, it won't stop going. No way to slow down. When I'm not feeling any desire to bracket, I feel that both APAs colluding with this move should have crime scene tapes around their convention sites. But we allow it by reinforcing therapeutic care as medical engineering in several ways. colluding with the sleight of hand that distress, suffering, and struggles in life are seen as physical illnesses by intervening and by genuflecting to the hierarchical authority of the physician. Difficulties in living are not medical illnesses and don't need to be treated, but explored and lived. And moreover, illness can be transformative rather than just a priori bad. Health is not the prime value for the phenomenologist. Understanding is, and an understanding that is neither incorporating, that is, reducing the other to my sameness, a la Levinas, nor colonizing, telling the other who he, she, or they are, a la Fanon. Yet medical modeling occurs even among humanistic, transpersonal, and existential therapists. We are medically modeled if we are intervening or correcting anything, whether we're correcting constrictions or inauthenticity, or not being actualized enough, or not being just enough, or not being ethical enough, or not having a high enough consciousness, or not being emotionally demonstrative enough, or even not bracketing enough. When we're doing this, we're not listening to the phenomenon at hand, but trying to engineer a preferred way of living. That preferred way of living may be the way to live that most benefits us all, but that's secondary to hearing all voices, want it or not. In my critiques throughout this talk, I'm aware that I'm also offering a preferred way of living. And perhaps there's no way out of this conundrum, this aporia. Even thinking of a way out reinforces the fact that there may not be a way out. But I hope that the bracketed and horizontal guardian of the intangibles has its own self-detonation when listening becomes prescribing. Deficit correction is grounded in soteriological thinking, or ontotheological supremacism of Gnostic purity and transcendence as ascendance. From this perspective, what is over, beyond, more, and above is better than what is under, behind, less, and below. This not enoughness inherently stigmatizes what was and is and shall be as inadequate to what shall be, all slotted in a rank-ordered scale of comparative measurement. As long as this continues, so will stigmatization as well as supremacism. Response from the guardian of the intangibles. I challenge us to use my good friend and colleague Miles Groth's phrase to propose a declaration of independence of therapeuticos from medical engineering. Rather than health service professionals, let's declare clinical psychology an oxymoron and reclaim our calling as iatros te spisuke, which I am reframing as guardians of the intangible. Therapeuticos is a non-interventionalist intervention. It is companioning, not fixing, walking with, not doing to, and the authority rests with the phenomenon of concern itself. One can be with another without doing to another and see these two ways of caring differently. In being with another, the phenomenologist can attend to the significance of constriction as well as freedom, of authenticity and inauthenticity, of emotional reserve and demonstrative expression, of pre-understandings and bracketing. One state of existence is not better than the other, as each is in a different worlding situation, living out different projects of significance. The Coronat and Shepherd of the clearing respect this value. There's nothing that is without significance, and staying horizontal means taking each phenomenon as it is in its own integrity and without requirements to be other than it is. The world will pull hard for us to verticalize things as good and bad, right and wrong, healthy and ill. A good host, though, as Derrida noted, doesn't meet guests at the door with demands to be otherwise. And as hosting still occurs on one's turf, the guardian of the intangible steps away from one's own house to companion with another as they follow the phenomenon out there on the road. The Good Samaritan cared for his presumed enemy on the road that belonged to neither of them, and met by chance, not by treatment plan. and the Samaritan paid his wounded frenemy. I'm just saying. What is, what was, and what shall be, each have their own phenomenality. Each event, each pathway gives us something and takes something away, and we have to choose, and we can only choose one thing at a time, even though we can redecide something in some way, but not all things in all ways. This is what it means to be undecidedly transimmanent. Not indecisive, as Derrida clarified, but with the awareness that any choice is inescapably a Kierkegaardian leap of madness. So there is no right way to live. It depends on one's web of meaning, context, and value system. The coronate, guardian, and shepherd listens for lived values without prescribing which ones are allowed. This is why the guardian of intangibles can be hated by even the so-called humanistic psychologist. I will sit with folks others don't want me to sit with, but I will also sit with those upset with me for doing so. This is how Will Campbell was able to be the chaplain to the Klan and was the only white man invited to be a part of King, Lewis, and SNCC. This is why the phenomenologist is multi-partial, to use Mick Cooper's word, so as to flex our clearing for any phenomenon, any way of being, in any direction. I have my own values and propositions on matters. One of them is not imposing them on others. I can also show you my long list of persons with whom I have a hard time sitting with. Frankly, Senator Blackburn from Tennessee was just added on my list. But that dilemma is not the fault of those on the list, nor is it my fault, but a collision of deeply held contrary values. I slouch in this direction of these difficult dialogues. I have not yet arrived. The pushback against masks and vaccines also disclose many intangibles that still need hearings, whether we agree with them or not. But one major one is a statement saying here that there are more valuable things than just medical discourse and medicalization. For the guardian of the intangibles, authority does not rest with the therapeutic or with the person seeking therapeutic care, but with the phenomenon itself. Something calls us both as companions towards somewhere, as we can only hearken the sound of its wind, but don't know from whither it comes or whence it goes. And the final piece of the ideological challenges to us is the privileging of efficient production. Change is directly equated with efficient production, which in turn becomes a commodity as a unit of eliminated symptoms. Again, an example of how therapeuticos has been hijacked and imprisoned as a practice of medical engineering. Suffering is viciously circulated as it is both in the way and needed to maintain a medicalization of existence. The medical model for soul and emotional suffering acts much like a systemic Munchausen by proxy. It goes out of business and loses its significance if there is no suffering to care for, but it tries to get rid of suffering as it gets in the way of other kinds of production demanded by the marketplace. Outcomes are required for funding, but the most significant outcomes may not show for years, long enough to starve while waiting on outcomes to secure funding. Outcomes also presume a direct causal link between what we do and what happens, unfettered by confounding variables, thus privileging a hegemony of natural science sleight of hand that collapses correlation into causation, or causation into correlation into causation, neither of which allow the phenomenon, medicalized as symptom, to speak. There is more intangible pain than voice in those seeking our care about feelings that they have failed in therapy to get better due to the chronic undertow of their persistent suffering, not to mention the therapist's feeling similarly, or its opposite, exacerbating a person's shame by imparting progress-based categories on them, such as resistance, denial, being difficult, untreatable, and so forth. We are training, indoctrinating carers of soul to quote unquote have or possess knowledge, skills, and attitudes, disclosing how the very process of training has ingested efficient production as its modus operandi. Students in class quake that their comments won't be foolproof or brilliant answers, lest they be seen as not knowing, when not knowing to me is the sine qua non quality of the guardian of the intangibles. Heaven forbid if a student cries in class or gets angry with a professor or confesses apathy about caring for others or talks of being attracted to somebody in therapy, as they will soon find themselves of concern with the faculty. Responses of the guardian of the intangibles. There is significance in feeling effective and having made an impact or wanting to make an impact. It's nice to know. Not knowing isn't a manifesto for being ignorant and proud of it. The experience of being rewarded with a degree or license for hard work, particularly for those who've had to fight to be considered for such rewards in the first place, is one of the beauties of life. But we can also be with others in a different economy of care, a releasement rather than a having, kenosis and emptying in Gelassenheit rather than sovereignty and acquisition. Let go of insisting on change and securing outcomes, and both will happen. Wu Wei, or changeless change, and the Tao teaches us that clearly. A therapy that requires change is not therapeuticals, but engineering. Change occurs on its own if it does at all. It comes as a gift and or by accident. We realize at some point that we have changed or not. An engineered change is a manipulated apparatus, and the bracketed phenomenologist clears space for someone who does not want to change. If you have to chart your progress, render to Caesar what's Caesar's until we realize that documentation and treatment planning are further medical practices that attempt to reify a process that is unrepeatable and unpredictable, as Lang taught us. Then let go of telos and keep the clearing open. Change is not required to receive love. This is how we can loosen commodification. Those who seek our care need not change. The coronat's clearing is useless intentionally. Actually, finding existential significance may give us symptoms, as my friend Anthony Stadlin reminds us, as does falling in love, or as does remembering the loss of someone we did and do love. So to offer a unconcluding post-scientific unterscript, I would say that in the powerlifting culture, we have a phrase we often use before a heavy lift, a lift that without spotters would crush us. WTFU. You feel me? Between now and August, when we check in again in Minnesota at the APA, let's live into being guardians of the intangibles in our respective situations in which we find ourselves, and then share in our critical discussion circles what we discovered. If you're looking for even more radical cage rattling activities in the upside down, here are some parting suggestions between here and there while out there. Suggestions, not prescriptions, and not as corrections, but openings to take or leave that are off the chain like a TikTok chip challenge. First one, rescue therapeuticals from its imprisonment as a practice of medical engineering and offer a declaration of independence from the medical model. Docs can be therapeutic, but therapeuticals is not medical engineering. Second, discover alternative ways of registering experience without measuring experience. Third, revisit alternative economies of care such as bartering, pay as you can, pay what you wish, trade services for volunteer work for someone else, or offer free soul care in an alternative to the dominance of getting all you can while giving as little as possible. Practice the spiritual disciplines of incessant reinterpretability, Wu Wei, yamevu, and hermeneutical vertigo. So much so that you go to dinner with the person you hate the most and discover something new about the person you know the most. Flush out where you're not bracketed. Do nothing, no thing with no aim for no specific length of time. Be useless in some way every day. Be just to someone unjust. Celebrate the beauty of something unfixed. Ask a taboo question out loud at some gathering. Find your middle voice in chorus space where conversations take place without having to go one way or the other, such as about where we are about suicide without preventing or facilitating it, or about the cloaked Romulan vessel at Skinwalker Ranch, or what sex is like in a love gap relationship or an age gap relationship, or what theology or how theology begins with atheism, even though we're all theologians. Break the grip of an economy of deservability. Pocket someone, that is, sneak some money into somebody's pocket or a gift in somebody's pocket. Forgive something unforgivable. Offer grace when condemnation is expected. Listen and forgive your own silent condemnations of others. Start a process group for professionals seeking to honor intangibles in institutions that try to kill such intangibles, and include a social worker, a psychiatrist, a chaplain, a lawyer, a business person, a physician, a teacher, a cook, a nurse, a maintenance person, and a parent. Wiggle your way into the law schools, business schools, divinity schools, and medical schools, and propose a continuing education course on the intangibles respected to those worlds. For instance, in law, to explore hermeneutical violence. In business, to look at the profit of expenditure without return. In divinity schools, to look at the movement from supremacism of ontotheology to the God who might be, perhaps. In medicine, to differentiate the physician from the engineer. Be vulnerable as a teacher. Let them see your ignorance and pain of confusion and embarrassment of thinking you should know but don't. Learn something together. Stay uncomfortable for a while. Celebrate soreness. Thank injury. Give something special of yours to someone who needs something special. Sit with a ghost, any ghost, for any reason. Ask an animal for advice. Ask an AI out for a date. Bring to mind and heart the tangible in any and every tangible moment, whether in grand rounds discussions, faculty meetings, teaching, hanging with the kids, cooking in the community, playing ball with the dog, sitting alone in the darkness. Whether it is the sadness in the tear, gratefulness in the exuberant leap, loneliness in the single place setting, or despair in the empty synapse. Finally, do all these things as expenditures without return, as gifts without remuneration, as offerings without recognition. Being intangible as guardians, stewards, coronets, and shepherds of intangible being is being Blanchot's light. The work of light is accomplished only when light makes us forget that something like light is at work. Thank you very much.
All right, Todd, thank you so much, man. Beautiful words as always. And I didn't know, like, given that we have a unique position with our conference setup this year, there's not an immediate session that people need to kind of be hopping off to. So I don't know if you're open to some question and answer time if people want to stick around.
Yeah, I'll hang. And it's okay if you take off. I just appreciate you enduring through that. So thank you for showing up.
Yeah, so what I will do, I'll stop the recording at this point and allow things to kind of be as informal or formal as they need to be.
Sounds good.